David Carter, a black homeowner in Willow Creek Estates, faced an injustice when HOA security singled him out for ID checks despite his registered access. The HOA board, led by Richard Simmons, dismissed his concerns, hiding prejudice behind the name of security protocol. But David used his own skills to build an app that turned the tables, revoking the security team's access entirely. Just wait until you hear how his quiet act of resistance became a movement and why justice ultimately prevailed. David Carter had always taken pride in his life at Willow Creek Estates. A skilled software developer in his mid-30s, he had worked hard to buy his home in this quiet suburban neighborhood. For David, Willow Creek was more than just an address. It was peace, stability, and the promise of security. Every evening he'd return to the sound of birds and the sight of neat lawns until that afternoon. It was a Tuesday. David had worked late, reviewing code for a project that could change his career. Exhausted but satisfied, he drove his Tesla toward the Willow Creek gate, his mind replaying the day's victories. He pulled up at the security checkpoint, expecting the usual friendly nod. Instead, two guards stepped forward, their expressions unreadable. "Sir, can I see your ID?" one of them said sharply. No greeting, no explanation. David blinked, surprised. "Of course," he said calmly, reaching for his wallet. The Tesla was registered with the HOA's digital access system. His badge should have made the ID request unnecessary. David knew this, and so did the guards. Still, they insisted. There was no question of error. It was deliberate. David handed over his ID without argument, but his voice carried a quiet edge. The guards examined it slowly, exchanging a glance that felt heavy with meaning. Neither said a word. Finally, one nodded and the other stepped aside. David drove through the gate, but the moment burned in his mind like fire. By the time he reached his driveway, David's confusion had turned to frustration. Something in their tone, the way they spoke, the pause before letting him through, felt wrong. It wasn't about security. It was about suspicion, about him. David knew the truth. The HOA had never stopped a white resident without cause. There had been no random checks on other neighbors. This was different. This was personal, and it stung deeply. That night, David sat with friends at a local coffee shop. He told them what happened, recounting the moment in detail. As he spoke, his voice tightened with anger. His friends listened, some nodding, others silent. When he finished, there was a long pause. "This isn't right," said Marcus, one of his friends. "You should take this to the HOA board." "I could," David replied, but his tone was firm. "A complaint won't fix this. They'll just dismiss it. I need to do more. This isn't about one incident. It's about a pattern, a system. And if I fight it, I need to be ready." His friends exchanged looks. Some were wary, others curious. But David had already decided. This wasn't a small battle. It was a fight for fairness. His mind was already working, calculating possibilities. As a software developer, he understood the power of technology. Maybe the answer wasn't just in words or meetings. Maybe it was something bigger. That night, David lay awake, replaying the incident again and again. He felt a burning determination. The injustice was sharp, undeniable. But so was his resolve. He wouldn't let it go. The incident at the gate wasn't just an annoyance. It was a spark that would grow into something stronger, something that would demand attention. David knew exactly what he needed to do. He would build something that couldn't be ignored, and when he did, Willow Creek Estates would never be the same. The morning after the gate incident, David Carter woke with a sense of unease he couldn't shake. The memory of the guard's tone lingered like a bruise. He couldn't pretend it was just a misunderstanding. Something about it cut deeper, something systematic. That day, David began to dig. He reviewed his own experience alongside the stories of other residents. Using his skills as a developer, he started analyzing community incident reports, gate access logs, and HOA records. It wasn't long before the pattern became painfully clear. Black homeowners were disproportionately stopped and asked for ID. The security checks weren't random, they were targeted. David felt a chill run through him. This wasn't about safety, it was prejudice, hidden behind a veneer of procedure. The HOA's so-called security policy was, in reality, a thin disguise for discrimination. For days, David worked in quiet determination. He gathered evidence, logs, testimonials, timestamps. He created a clear record of the inequality. Each entry fueled his resolve. It wasn't only about his own dignity anymore. It was about something much larger. Finally, David decided it was time to confront the HOA board. He prepared meticulously, assembling charts and proof that left no room for doubt. On the night of the meeting, he entered the boardroom filled with neighbors and HOA officials. His heart beat fast. This was the moment to turn his private frustration into public awareness. "Good evening," David began, his voice steady despite the knot of nerves in his chest. "What happened to me at the gate isn't an isolated case. It's part of a pattern. Here is the data that proves it." He projected graphs and logs showing the disproportionate checks. Murmurs rippled through the room, but the response was not what he expected. Board members exchanged glances. One of them, a middle-aged man named Richard Simmons, cleared his throat. "David, we appreciate your effort, but this is part of our security protocol. There's no evidence of bias. These are just random checks." His tone was dismissive. Another member nodded in agreement. David's chest tightened. He spoke again, trying to make them see. "It's not random. You can see the pattern in these logs. This isn't just about me. It's about fairness and dignity for every homeowner here." But the board remained unmoved. Some members murmured about procedures and security needs. Others avoided eye contact. The meeting ended with vague promises to look into it. There was no acknowledgement of the problem, no real resolution. David walked home that night with a heavy weight in his chest. It wasn't just frustration anymore. It was pain. He realized this wasn't going to be a simple fight. This was a battle against a system designed to ignore him. The HOA had turned his evidence into noise. They dismissed his voice, and in that silence, he felt something worse than defeat: isolation. For the first time, David wondered if speaking out had been a mistake. His phone buzzed with messages, some supportive, some warning him to step back. But then came an official letter from the HOA, a warning about disruptive behavior and a thinly veiled threat of retaliation. They were telling him, without saying it, that challenging them could cost him dearly. David read the words again and again. He feared the fight might cost him more than peace of mind. It could cost his home. Yet, beneath that fear burned something stronger, a determination. The insult at the gate had been more than personal. It was proof of a systemic problem no one wanted to acknowledge. And now David knew. To fight this, he couldn't rely on words alone. He would have to build something undeniable. something that couldn't be ignored, something that would make the truth impossible to dismiss. The pain settled deep inside him that night, but so did resolve. David was no longer fighting for himself alone. He was fighting for the dignity of every black homeowner in Willow Creek Estates. And he knew the road ahead would not be easy. David Carter could have walked away. After the HOA meeting, after the dismissal, after the thinly veiled threats, it would have been easy to let the incident fade into the background. But he couldn't. The pain of being ignored, of being dismissed, had turned into something else, a burning resolve. He wasn't going to wait for the system to change. He was going to build the change himself. David spent long nights in his home office, surrounded by notebooks, code, and coffee mugs. His fingers moved across the keyboard with purpose. As a software developer, he understood the power of technology. Now, that knowledge became his weapon. He began designing a mobile app, something that would allow homeowners to control access to the community gate digitally. It would be practical, useful, and above all, empowering. Every homeowner could grant or revoke access for guests or service personnel. But David built something more into it, something hidden, a control that allowed him to revoke access for specific security teams. This wasn't just a tool, it was a statement. It was a quiet form of resistance. For weeks, David refined the app. He tested it quietly, working late into the night. Then he approached the HOA board under a different guise, presenting it as an innovative solution to improve security and streamline gate access. The board welcomed it without suspicion. They saw it as a modern upgrade, unaware of David's true intent. On a Monday morning, David drove toward the Willow Creek gate. His heart beat faster than usual. It was the day to test his creation. As he approached, the same two security guards who had stopped him weeks earlier stepped forward. One raised his hand, ready to demand David's ID again. But David was ready. His phone buzzed quietly in his pocket. He opened the app. In a few taps, he activated the hidden control. On the guard's side of the security terminal, the system flashed something unmistakable: access denied. For a moment, there was silence. The guards stared at the screen, confusion spreading across their faces. David slowed, looking directly at them. His expression was calm, but inside something surged, a mix of relief, triumph, and vindication. Without another word, the gate opened for David alone. The guards stepped aside, powerless to stop him. David drove through, the Tesla humming softly. For the first time since that afternoon, he felt a deep sense of satisfaction. Word spread quickly. Within days, residents were talking about it. At the grocery store, neighbors stopped him to ask what happened. At the coffee shop, whispers of the incident grew louder. The app became more than a convenience. It became a symbol of fairness, a symbol of resistance. Homeowners began questioning the HOA's security practices. They asked David for details. He shared the story carefully, knowing this was more than his fight now. It was theirs, too. The app gave them not just access control, but a voice. For David, it wasn't about confrontation for the sake of conflict. It was about creating hope, a real possibility that the neighborhood could change. The app was more than code. It was proof that technology could shift power, that one person could find a way to challenge an unjust system without violence or destruction. That Monday morning became a turning point. What started as an act of frustration transformed into a movement. The gates of Willow Creek Estates were no longer just a barrier. They were a test of fairness, and David had rewritten the rules. For the first time since the incident, David felt optimism. The fight wasn't over, but now he had a plan, and he knew the truth. Change didn't come from waiting. Change came from action. David's hope wasn't just for himself anymore. It was for every homeowner who deserved respect, equality, and dignity. And in that moment, as he drove through the gate, he knew the real work was just beginning. By midweek, word of what David Carter had done was everywhere in Willow Creek Estates. His quiet resistance, the access denied moment, had sparked something bigger than anyone expected. On social media, neighborhood groups buzzed with screenshots, videos, and conversations. For some, it was a matter of curiosity. For others, it was a call to action. The HOA board could no longer ignore it. The chatter among residents grew into pressure the board couldn't sidestep. By Friday afternoon, they called an emergency meeting. The community hall filled quickly. Neighbors crowded in, their faces a mixture of anticipation, anger, and hope. Cameras from local news crews had even arrived. David arrived quietly, carrying his laptop and notes. When the meeting began, the room fell into murmurs. Richard Simmons, the HOA president, tried to open with procedural remarks, but David stood before the microphone and spoke calmly, with measured clarity. "Neighbors," he said, "what happened to me at the gate was not an isolated incident. It was the symptom of a larger problem. I've gathered evidence showing that certain residents, particularly black homeowners, have been singled out for ID checks more than others. This is bias. This is discrimination. And it's not acceptable in our community." He clicked to display graphs, charts, and logs he had compiled. Murmurs rose again, louder this time. Faces in the audience shifted from disbelief to recognition. Then David brought up his app. With a simple demonstration, he showed how homeowners could now control gate access digitally, and how the tool he built could prevent abuse of power. His voice was steady, but there was passion in it. "This is not about me," he said. "It's about fairness, dignity, and respect for every resident in Willow Creek Estates." Board members shifted uneasily. Some avoided eye contact. Others whispered among themselves. The evidence was irrefutable, and the room's energy turned from curiosity to outrage. By the end of the meeting, the board had no choice. Under the pressure of public scrutiny, they voted to revise the HOA's security protocols. They agreed to remove any procedures that allowed arbitrary ID checks without clear cause. They also promised to review policies regularly and to include resident oversight. It was a victory. But for David, it meant more than policy changes. His app, now fully functional and open source, was offered freely to other communities facing similar challenges. What began as a personal stand had grown into a tool for change. In the weeks that followed, David was invited to speak at neighborhood meetings across the state. Articles were written. His story spread online. Willow Creek Estates became a case study in how technology and courage could transform injustice into progress. One evening, a few weeks later, David stood before his neighbors again. It was an ordinary gathering in the community hall, but the energy was anything but ordinary. He spoke simply, but with deep conviction. "Justice isn't something you wait for, it's something you build." There was applause, not the polite kind, but the kind that comes from a place of shared understanding. David looked out at the crowd. Neighbors who once ignored the problem, now standing beside him. The moment was bigger than him. It was the moment a community reclaimed its dignity. For David, this was the true triumph. Not the headlines, not the changes in policy, but the knowledge that his actions had sparked a movement, that what began as humiliation at the gate became a powerful example of how innovation can challenge injustice. David's app became a model for other neighborhoods, a reminder that tools can be designed not just for convenience, but for fairness. More than that, his story became inspiration, proof that one person's voice, backed by determination and creativity, can change the rules of the game. Standing there in front of Willow Creek Estates, David felt something deeper than victory. He felt hope, and in that hope was a legacy, the knowledge that even the smallest spark can grow into something that lights the way for others.